The clock on the Shima hospital wall stopped at 8:15. 1 minute before, a city of 350,000 souls was making breakfast, boarding streetcars, reporting for demolition duty under a cloudless summer sky. 1 minute after, that city was gone, replaced by a flattened disk of fire and silence stretching 2 miles in every direction. The heat came first. Not ordinary heat. A thermal pulse of 3,000 degrees that lasted less than a second and burned human shadows into stone. The blast wave hit a fraction of a second later, faster than sound, peeling buildings off their foundations like bark from a dead tree. And after that, silence. The kind of silence that made people think they were dead. But the ones still breathing didn't know what had happened to them. Nobody did. The weapon that had just erased their city had never been used on human beings before. What they walked through in the hours that followed hadn't existed before that morning. After it, the world would never not know what a single bomb could do. Hiroshima was a river city, built across the broad delta of the Ota, which split into 6 channels before emptying into the inland sea. The water gave the city its shape, its beauty, and its vulnerability. Wooden bridges linked neighborhoods across those channels. Wooden houses, packed tightly along narrow lanes, spread outward from a compact urban core. And at the center, the old castle grounds, headquarters of the Second Army, rose on stone foundations that had survived centuries of typhoons and earthquakes. Hiroshima had endured nature's worst. It had no framework for what was coming from the sky. By the summer of 1945, the city held a strange, suspended quality. Japan's major industrial centers had been systematically firebombed for months. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, all had been ravaged by Curtis LeMay's incendiary campaigns. But Hiroshima remained largely untouched. American bombers flew over periodically, and residents heard the distant drone, but the bombs fell elsewhere. Some believed the city had been spared because of its beauty. Others suspected relatives in America had interceded. A darker rumor circulated among the military that the Americans were saving Hiroshima for something special. That rumor was correct. Within the classified corridors of the Manhattan Project, Hiroshima sat near the top of a carefully curated target list. The selection criteria were methodical. The city needed to be large enough to demonstrate the weapon's power. It needed to be compact enough that the blast would not dissipate across open terrain. And it needed to be undamaged. The whole point was to measure what one bomb could do to an intact city, no prior destruction to confuse the data. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey would need clean numbers. Hiroshima's geography, flat, concentrated, ringed by hills that would focus the shockwave, made it nearly ideal. 350,000 human beings lived inside that ideal geometry. And on the morning of August 6th, as the city woke to a warm, still Monday, a silver B-29 named the Enola Gay was already 40 minutes into its flight from the island of Tinian, carrying a uranium-235 device codenamed Little Boy in its forward bomb bay. 43 seconds. That's how long Little Boy took to fall from 31,000 feet to 1,900 feet above the Shima hospital courtyard. Everything after those 43 seconds is what this story is about. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb detonated. The fireball expanded to roughly 600 feet in diameter within 1 second, reaching surface temperatures that rivaled the outer layer of the sun. At ground level directly beneath the hypocenter, the thermal radiation was so intense that human bodies were carbonized before nerve endings could register pain. Roof tiles bubbled. Granite steps recorded the silhouettes of people who had been sitting on them an instant before, their bodies vaporized, their shadows baked permanently into stone by the bleaching of surrounding surfaces. The blast wave followed a fraction of a second later, traveling outward at roughly 700 miles per hour. Within half a mile of the hypocenter, virtually every structure, wood, brick, reinforced concrete, was flattened or gutted. The pressure wave did not merely knock buildings down. It crushed them, drove their fragments horizontally through the air like shrapnel from an artillery shell the size of a city block. Glass windows within 2 miles shattered inward, and the flying shards embedded themselves in walls, in furniture, in human flesh. And then came the silence. Survivors within a mile described a moment of total stillness, as though the blast had swallowed every sound in the city and hadn't yet given it back. Sound returned gradually, strangely. The creak of structures still collapsing, the hiss of broken water mains, and under it all, a sound that kept getting louder. Nobody knew what it was yet. It was the sound of a city beginning to burn. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, a physician at the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, was standing in his home roughly a mile and a half from the hypocenter when the flash came. The blast hurled him across the room. When he stood, dazed, he found that his clothes had been torn from his body, and shards of glass protruded from his skin. His house was collapsing around him. He stumbled into the garden and began walking toward the hospital. What he saw on that walk became one of the most detailed and clinically precise accounts of the immediate aftermath. His diary, published years later, records the experience with the quiet precision of a man trained to observe even when his own body was failing. The streets were unrecognizable. Landmarks had vanished. Houses were flattened into kindling, and across every surface lay a fine gray dust, pulverized concrete and what had once been the material of daily life. But it was the people that stopped him. They moved in slow processions, arms held out from their bodies at an unnatural angle. Hachiya did not understand this posture at first. Then he realized the skin on their arms and hands had been seared and was hanging in sheets, and they held their arms outward to keep the raw surfaces from touching. Their faces were swollen beyond recognition. Many had no hair. Some walked in complete silence. Others made a low, continuous moan, a sound that Hachiya would record in his diary not as screaming, but as something closer to exhaustion given voice. He was looking at flash burns, caused by the direct thermal radiation of the detonation, which had lasted less than a second but had deposited enough energy to cook exposed skin at distances of over a mile. These burns didn't match anything the doctors had been trained for. Not flame burns. Not chemical burns. Radiant heat moving at the speed of light. There was no precedent for treating them at this scale. The patterns were grotesque in their specificity. Dark-colored clothing had absorbed the radiation, burning the skin beneath it, while light-colored clothing reflected it, leaving the skin underneath relatively intact. A woman's flower-patterned dress had transferred its own design onto her body in a map of blistered and unblistered skin. But what no one understood yet, what would not become clear for days and weeks, was that the most lethal effect of the bomb was entirely invisible. Within 30 minutes, the hundreds of small fires ignited by the thermal pulse had merged into a single mass fire. The superheated air above the city center rose violently, pulling cooler air inward from the periphery at gale force. This created a firestorm, a self-sustaining vortex of flame that consumed everything combustible within its reach. Temperatures inside the fire zone exceeded 1,000 degrees. The winds reached speed strong enough to uproot weakened trees and to drag debris and people toward the center of the blaze. Survivors who had initially escaped the blast now faced a second, slower wave of destruction. Those trapped under collapsed buildings were incinerated. Those who could still walk fled toward the rivers, the same 6 channels of the Ota that had given Hiroshima its beauty. Thousands waded into the water. Many never came out. Weakened by burns and injuries, they slipped under the surface and drowned in the same rivers where they had fished and swum as children. By noon, a massive column of smoke and debris rose over the city. Nobody on the ground had a word for what they were seeing above them. The military would call it a mushroom cloud later. That morning it was just a column of black smoke so tall it had its own weather. In the entire city of Hiroshima, on the entire morning of August 6th, only one person took photographs of what was happening. His name was Yoshito Matsushige, a photographer for the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper. He had been at home, about 2.5 miles from the hypo center, when the blast blew out his windows. He grabbed his camera and began walking toward the city center. He took 5 photographs. Later he would explain why so few, not because of technical failure, but because his hands shook too badly to press the shutter. He could not bring himself to raise the camera. The scenes before him, the burned children, the stunned columns of walking wounded, paralyzed the professional instinct that had always governed his work. He stood before subjects that demanded documentation, and his body refused. Matsushige's 5 photographs stayed unseen for years. The world wouldn't publish them until after it had done the same thing again, to Nagasaki, 3 days later. By afternoon, something new began to happen. Something that no military planner, no physicist, and no physician in Hiroshima could yet explain. People who had survived the blast and the firestorm with seemingly minor injuries began to collapse. They developed nausea. Their gums bled. Their hair fell out in clumps. Within days, the inside of their mouths would ulcerate, their white blood cell counts would crash, and they would die of infections their bodies could no longer fight. This was acute radiation syndrome, the effect of the massive burst of gamma rays and neutrons released at detonation. The radiation had torn through their cells in an instant, invisible, unfelt, shredding DNA, killing the bone marrow that made their blood, destroying the lining of their guts. The damage was done at 8:15. The dying took weeks. And then the rescuers started dying. Soldiers, relatives searching for the missing, medical teams from surrounding towns. They entered the city in the afternoon and evening, and within days they began showing the same symptoms. They had not been present for the blast. They had walked into the residual radiation field and absorbed doses that would kill them slowly, from the inside. The city was poisoned. The very dust that coated every surface, the water in the rivers, the black rain that began falling in the northwestern suburbs within hours of the explosion, all of it carried radioactive fallout. The black rain was oily, sticky, and left dark stains on skin and clothing. Children caught it in their mouths, thinking it was water. It was water, mixed with the pulverized, irradiated debris of everything the bomb had consumed. Hiroshima had become a weapon even after the weapon had detonated. The destruction of Hiroshima wasn't an accident. It came from a specific chain of decisions, each one rational on its own terms, that together led somewhere no one had been before. Start with the technology. The physics behind the atomic bomb were not secret. They were published in open journals throughout the 1930s. What the Manhattan Project accomplished was not a theoretical breakthrough but an industrial one. It took the abstract equations of nuclear fission and engineered them into a deliverable weapon through an unprecedented mobilization of resources. Over 125,000 people worked on the project. Most had no idea what they were building. The total cost exceeded $2,001,945, roughly $30 billion in today's currency. The bomb proved something beyond its own destructive power. It proved that the American industrial economy, running at full wartime capacity, could do things no other country on Earth could do. That was part of the point. Then consider the decision. Secretary of War Henry Stimson's post-war justification rested on a single argument, that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and potentially millions of Japanese casualties. This calculus was genuine. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated, with terrible clarity, the cost of assaulting defended Japanese positions. Military planners projected Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion, would dwarf the Normandy landings in both scale and bloodshed. But the decision was not purely military. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa has argued persuasively that the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8 may have been as decisive in compelling Japanese surrender as the bombs themselves. The Japanese leadership faced not only atomic destruction but the prospect of Soviet invasion of Manchuria and potentially Hokkaido. The bomb alone did not end the war. The convergence of nuclear terror and geopolitical encirclement did. And beneath both arguments lay something deeper, the momentum of total war itself. By August 1945, the rules had changed. Or rather, the old rules had been burned away one city at a time. Tokyo, Dresden, Hamburg. 100,000 civilians dead in a single raid had already happened. The atomic bomb didn't break new moral ground. It just did the job faster. It did with one device what had previously required 300 bombers and an entire night. This is the pattern that deserves the most careful attention. Not the decision of any single leader, but the structure that made the decision feel rational. The people who planned the firebombing campaigns knew exactly how many civilians they were killing. The numbers were in the reports. What they didn't do was let those numbers change anything. And by the time the atomic bomb was ready, stopping felt harder than dropping it. The scientists who built the bomb understood this. Many of them. Robert Oppenheimer's invocation of the Bhagavad Gita, his reported thought that he had become the destroyer of worlds, was not theatrical posturing. It was the recognition that a threshold had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. The knowledge existed now. It would spread. And the logic that had produced Hiroshima could produce something far worse. Within a decade, thermonuclear weapons 1,000 times more powerful than Little Boy would be tested. Within 2 decades, the superpowers would accumulate arsenals capable of ending human civilization several times over. Hiroshima was the doorway. On the other side, humanity would spend the next 80 years trying to figure out how to live with what it had built. In the ruins of Hiroshima, in the late afternoon of August 6th, a thing happened that the strategic planners had not modeled. People helped each other. Burned, blinded, poisoned by radiation they couldn't see, they shared water with strangers. They carried people they had never met. They tore strips from their own damaged clothing to bandage wounds they could not identify on bodies they could barely see. This is not a redemptive coda. The suffering was not ennobled by the response to it. The dead, estimates range from 70,000 to 80,000 by the end of that first day, rising to roughly 140,000 by December, were not redeemed by the courage of the living. The children who drank the black rain were not saved by their innocence. But the record left by the survivors, the hibakusha, the explosion-affected people, a term they would carry for the rest of their lives, became something the strategic bombing survey couldn't produce. Their testimony told you what the blast radius felt like from inside, what it meant to be the unit of destruction, to be the data point that can speak. Nobel laureate Kenzaburo Oe, who visited Hiroshima years later and spoke with survivors, wrote not of their anger but of their dignity, and of the moral weight they carried on behalf of a species that preferred not to think about what it had built. The survivors did not allow the world that luxury. They kept talking about it. Year after year, to anyone who would listen, they described what happened that morning. Some of them were still doing it 70 years later. The ruins of Hiroshima were eventually cleared. A new city rose on the same delta, along the same 6 channels of the Oda. The hypocenter is now a park. The skeletal dome of the old Industrial Promotion Hall, one of the few structures left partially standing near Ground Zero, was preserved as a monument. Tourists photograph it in the afternoon light. School children lay wreaths at its base. The stones are warm in the sun. The rivers still flow to the inland sea. And in vaults around the world, roughly 12,500 nuclear warheads, most of them 100 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, wait in their silos, tended by professionals, governed by protocols, restrained by systems that have held for 80 years. 80 years. A single human lifetime. In the long calendar of civilizations, it is not even a breath. Hiroshima asks one question, and it never stops asking it. Not whether the systems that keep those weapons in their silos will hold. Of course, that's the fear. The real question is whether human beings can maintain the discipline to never use them again. Not once. Not as a crisis escalates. Not when the decision-makers are tired, or scared, or cornered. Never. For as long as the weapons exist. The Hibakusha believed the answer was yes. They had to. The rest of us haven't proved them right yet. But the second bomb was already being loaded, and the city it was aimed at was not even the original target. If this journey through time captured your imagination, smash that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Every like helps our channel grow, and every subscription brings you closer to our next destination.